Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. I am really looking forward to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. We will be discussing a new book by Steve Beirn entitled Well Sent, Reimagining the Church's Missionary Sending Process. Steve will join us to discuss some of the very practical ideas from the book and how our churches can continue to be proactive and healthy as they engage in cross-cultural ministry. Just before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
InterServe is a community of men and women using our professional skills to do kingdom work in Asia and the Arab world. We believe God has given each of us interests, skills, and talents. We believe He has led us into programs of study, fields of education, and career paths so that we can use our vocations to live a holistic ministry amongst the least reached people. We aim to see lives and communities transformed by encounter with Jesus. To learn how you can get involved, visit interservecanada.org today. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hello again, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's interview with Steve Beirn. He is the pastor of Global Ministries at Calvary Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and his main focus is to mobilize the local church to recruit, prepare, send, and sustain cross-cultural workers in unreached parts of the world. He has served in local church ministry for 40 years, married to Lorraine, and together have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Mags.
You were introduced to me by some very highly valued colleagues, Scott and Leslie Powell. Just a quick shout out to Scott and Leslie, who serve with Send International. They're very thankful that you're at their church. Would you just take a moment to go back in your history, tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be passionate about God's mission?
Well, I certainly would, and I am, I think, passionate about missions. It really began with a church that heavily emphasized missions, so I grew up in that environment. In addition to that, I had the blessing of getting a good Bible education. And then finally, part of my maturing process in missions was attempting to capture the next missions-minded generation within our church and subsequently integrating missions into the ministry to bring that about. So I think those were the biggest contributions to my life as it relates to missions.
And a lot of your experience has now come together in a recent book. The book is entitled Well Sent, Reimagining the Church's Missionary Sending Process. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today in this interview. Steve, in your book, you discuss the role of the church in missions. Let's begin there. What is the church's role in sending out mission workers?
Well, I think the church's role is to, first of all, have the church leadership understand that that's a key thing that they need to participate in. And then beyond that, for the church leadership to challenge a church family, then secondly, equip them to be able to send and sustain others. So the equipping and sustaining ministry becomes a very important part of what a church does. They need to prepare themselves and then execute that kind of ministry for sending.
It sounds like there's a lot of elements for a church to participate in. This is not just a single task.
Yes, that's right. It's a very broad task that can be broken down into manageable parts. Sure. But there are a variety of things that are involved in this.
So, just as we get going into this, then, what are some of the benefits you see for a church? How does a church benefit from being intentional about sending out workers?
Well, I think the first thing that people need to understand is that sending is a transformative experience for the church. And it's transformative in this regard. First of all, it personalizes the Great Commission, or it helps people personalize the Great Commission. And then living out the Word of God is a wonderful and beneficial thing. But secondly, I think it also presents the church with a fresh set of challenges and opportunities. So as a result, you have a local body that's stretched in terms of their faith, and that enables their faith to grow. And then, Mags, I think too, when the church goes to the nations, their perspective on life changes. So, for instance, they have an acute, greater sense of spiritual darkness. It's readily apparent. And then their perspective on the lives of people and cultures will change too. So that's a very healthy thing.
It is somewhat simplified and generalized, I appreciate, but in your book, you talk about three kinds of churches when it comes to cross-cultural ministry. Please take just a moment and describe these three churches for us.
Yes, the three types of churches that I talk about in the book are listed in Appendix 6 in the form of a chart. So the chart basically speaks of the inactive, the reactive, and the proactive church. For instance, the inactive church has no vision cast, the reactive church has old vision cast, and the proactive church has new vision cast. And these churches, Mags, can be characterized by one word, one or two words usually. The inactive church is characterized by missions ignorance, the reactive church, missions procedures, and then the proactive church by missions objectives.
Very helpful ideas, ignorance or procedures or objectives. And there's a sense of opportunity to grow in the inactive church through reactive or maybe on the way reactive toward proactive. In any case, we're trying to get to the proactive church, right?
That's correct. I mean, if someone were to come and to say, if I only had a great missions policy manual, that would be the key to a good missions program. And that would be true if you want to be a reactive church. But only objectives from a proactive church are capable of moving a church forward. So procedures are important, but objectives need to be put in place to move the church.
So we need rails to run on. That's the procedures, but we also need a destination.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
You have spoken about distractions. A church that would like to be proactive, it would like to be a healthy, mission-minded church. What are some of the things that can distract a church?
Well, there are a variety of things that nowadays are capable of literally derailing a church, but I've placed all these into just one of two categories. First, the church has the danger of mission drift, and then they have the danger of mission creep. Mission drift, then, Mags, would be wandering from original priorities. But mission creep would be expanding beyond the original goals and actually diluting the process. So we have to guard ourselves from both of those.
I wonder if you'd expand just a little bit more on those. What does drift look like for a local church?
Well, drift is you're participating or seeing drift in the church when the time and attention and direction of a church ministry in terms of missions continues to shrink. It's less a part of church ministry and not reflected strongly in their list of priorities. So that's what we're talking about here when we drift. But when we also experience creep, it's just beginning to dilute something so extensively that it becomes relatively meaningless. For instance, the word missions, it means so many different things to different people. So the only way to protect yourself from mission creep is to define terms and then to annually evaluate your ministry on the basis of the defined terms.
Well, great transition. Some churches will be willing to evaluate their current approaches and their current attitudes. What are some of the key questions that you have discovered for churches to ask themselves?
Well, I think the most fundamental question, and it's a broad question, but the fundamental question is this: if every local church in the world modeled their missions efforts after the missions efforts of your church, would the Great Commission ever be completed?
Wow.
Yeah, I think, and then in addition to that, I think two more practical, more specific questions. Um, One would be, when was the last time your local church sent out a church member overseas vocationally? I think that also just speaks a great deal to understanding what we're called to do and how to move the gospel across cultures.
Hmm.
And then I think the second smaller, more specific question is, what is your church's relationship, your present relationship to the remaining unfinished task? What are you still attempting to accomplish in terms of fulfilling the Great Commission? So
Mm.
those things will give someone a great deal of insight into where they presently are as it relates to missions commitments.
Hmm. Hmm. I just take this opportunity to remind those who are listening that we take show notes during these interviews. There's some great ideas here, and they will all be captured in the show notes. You can get those on the website if you're driving or listening in some way that you can't take notes here. Steve, let's imagine that a church has asked some of these questions and they have discovered, okay, we're actually a reactive church or even maybe an inactive church. Let's turn toward the positive, practical ideas. What are some things a church should be doing to start becoming a healthy sending church?
Well, I think one of the more important things for a church to do is for the church leadership to explain to their local body that sending is to be a part of their regular ministry. So to officially go on record as saying, we believe this is not only a valid but a vital part of getting the Great Commission accomplished, that's going to be a key to it. And then in addition to that, Mags, I think there are a wide variety of things that can be done. For instance, having testimonies of some who've been sent out, whether it be from one local assembly or another. Just the fact that they're modeling being sent is, I think, a powerful and healthy thing. And then I think also something that's somewhat overlooked is to literally pray to the Lord of the harvest that he'll send out laborers. So I think it's something that a local church needs to follow up on, and how they apply themselves to that Matthew 9:38 text is up to them. But they need to be intentional even about praying for laborers. And then I think even if people were just to get others overseas, those kinds of things are normal, healthy things, because even in the New Testament, we see that the church, even the early church, was a mobile church. So I think that's important.
Well, I'll just mention a part of a chapter in your book for those folks who are part of a church and they would love for their pastor or their church leadership to be more missions minded. A number of people have related that experience to me. We have interest in missions, but we're not sure that our pastor leaders really understand that. And they want to proceed with respect and with honor to the leaders. In one of the chapters, you outline, and we won't go through them all now, but you outline some wise approaches for a missions committee in that situation. I was just looking to see, it's in chapter 4 of Steve's book, and we'll put those in the show notes as well, those ideas there, and how you can encourage your church leadership to be really a part of thinking through this. An important part of the church's role will be to help get workers ready, Steve. At this point, I want to ask, what are some ways that the church can participate effectively in preparing mission workers? What should they be doing?
Well, first of all, it's important for a church to understand that they can become an effective learning laboratory for missionary candidates. And this laboratory can begin to help them shape more of an effective lifestyle for crossing cultures overseas and living and displaying and articulating the gospel. And I think, too, Mags, one important distinction here, there are a lot of schools and organizations that emphasize credentialing, and that's an important part, I believe, of preparation. But that's not necessarily what the church needs to participate in. The church needs to focus on competencies. Can a person adequately execute the ministry? So I think we say in our church ministry, and I share it in the book, that there are four basic building blocks to build competency. One is assessment, developing a strong sense of self-awareness. A second is spiritual growth, and that would be, can a person literally share their faith and they know how to effectively do that, or are they presently praying for the world?
Right.
And then thirdly, ministry experience, helping them get their feet wet to do what they're eventually going to be doing overseas. And then finally, mentoring, having people who have some spiritual wisdom and discernment and maturity just to speak into their lives and to be a help and encouragement for them. Those we found to be healthy building blocks to really shape the life of a missionary candidate.
Steve, I wonder if you just comment on how big a church needs to be to participate in this process. Is there any size requirement? A church needs to be a certain size, certain number of members, certain budget to do this?
Well, I think that's one of the misnomers that needs to be dispelled. Most people think, well, big churches can do that. They have budgets or personnel. They have the experience and the expertise. But the truth is that a church of almost any size can begin to get into this game of preparing missionary candidates. And smaller churches also need to know that they can join forces with other churches to work together to facilitate this. So if they need more critical mass, then they can seek that with like-minded churches and work together and collaborate. But it certainly can be done with a church of any size. So the book spells a little bit of that out too. So a person shouldn't be afraid if they're reading the book or hearing this podcast and thinking, well, we're just a church of 100 people. We just can't do that. When in fact, the head of the church is ready and willing to move by his Spirit to bring that to being into the life of the church.
Boy, that's helpful. And the idea of collaborating and sharing with other churches as well to see workers sent out. If a single church can't manage at all, I hope that's hopeful and potential for even some smaller congregations or life groups, things like that.
That's right. I mean, I know, Mags, of one situation where there are 8 churches of approximately 100 people each. Mm-hmm. And those 8 churches joined together. And now by being 800 strong, they feel far more effective and just empowered to be able to execute the ministry.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Well, as far as vision goes, in your book, you also suggest that a church shouldn't stop when they adopt a missionary. Certainly, we want them to adopt a sense of ownership and care for mission workers, but that's not the whole story. You say they should adopt more. What more should a church adopt?
Well, the one weakness of a sending church model, and there are weaknesses to every model, but the weakness of a sending church model is that a church and its members will adopt the worker, but not also the work, when most effective ministry would be to adopt both. And I can give you a brief example of this. There was a family that was sent overseas to West Africa. They labored in the field for 10 years. They had to come back stateside to North America simply because of health problems with both the husband and a wife. They went to their supporting churches and they asked, how many of you people in these churches are still praying for that unreached people group that we've been relating to? And they said, we're not praying for that unreached people group. We're praying for you. And then they said they realized for the first time in their lives that they had a completely different focus than the people who were supporting them. So there is a tendency to attach ourselves to the worker to such a degree that if the worker comes home, so does the vision for ministry come home. So do the resources. So does the prayer. And we're attempting to just suggest that that prayer needs to be fixed on both the worker and the work for the Great Commission to get effectively done.
Yeah, it sounds very wise. Boy, such helpful ideas. I'd like to touch on one more, Steve, and that's the idea of cooperating with mission agencies. You actually spend a chapter in the book here, the relationship between a sending church and the agency, or the help of an agency. Would you just describe a little bit of this triangle, if you will? 3 points on a triangle, one being the mission worker, another being the sending church, and the agency. How do those relationships fit together?
Well, first of all, it is helpful to make distinctions about boundaries and ways of participating between these three entities. And by understanding that fairly clearly, you develop a healthy and a strong triangle. So that's my attempt to try to urge churches and individuals and agencies to kind of collaborate together as they work to accomplish the Great Commission. So I think the first thing is just that the church is the sender of missionaries and the agency is the facilitator. And then that helps the candidate understand why they relate to both the church and the agency. The agency can facilitate certain things that a church can never facilitate.
Right.
And likewise, the church has its own unique contribution it can make because of its special relationship to the candidate. So by understanding these dynamics, it really strengthens the entire sending process so that all the expertise from each of these three entities can be put to work and really leveraged for the glory of God.
Mm-hmm. Well, boy, there's so many helpful ideas here. Steve, I just want to mention your book again quick and highly recommend this to our listeners. It's a very practical book. Lots of years of experience poured into this book, Steve.
Yes, my desire is just to become an encourager for those that are the missions practitioners out there. I can speak theology, I can talk strategies, but my heart is with the missions practitioner. And so, Mags, it's our desire to try to come alongside and be a helper and encouragement to them, because there are many of them out there, good ones. They just need some additional support. Yeah.
Well, you're on the right path. I think I'll just mention this book title again. It's called Well Sent. It's very readable, very practical, as you've heard in this discussion already. And there's a lot of material. There's about 50 pages of appendices at the end that have sample policies, diagrams, and worksheets that may be helpful to you and your church as you think through being a healthy sending church. With that resource before us, Steve, I wonder if there are other resources that you would recommend churches consider as they're going about this work.
Well, there certainly are some other books out there that can be very, very useful for people. A classic text called Serving as Senders by Neil Perolo. That's extremely beneficial. Another text would be To Timbuktu and Beyond by Marcia Woodard. It's a William Carey Library book. That is just outstanding for the strategic nature of bringing the church and the candidate and the agency together. And then another book just entitled Mission Smart by David Fraser. All of these things will help in the process of getting people sent and better equip the church. So those are just a couple, but there's a lot of related material out there, so they should just avail themselves of this and just be a good student of these things.
I'll mention this. We did an interview with Neil Perolo that you just mentioned there on the podcast as well. And I don't have the number right at my fingertips which episode that was, but it's on the website. If you're interested in looking at Neil's interview, listening to that, you find that in the archives on the website. Steve, we've touched on so many things just lightly. If our listeners would like to learn more from you, how might they follow you or be in touch with you?
Well, I certainly would love to be a further help or encouragement to others that are the missions practitioners. So the simplest thing would be to email me. It's just SBEIRN, that's a first initial last name, @calvarychurch.org. And I'd be able to respond and start the dialogue and perhaps a friendship and be of further support if I can.
Well, what a super time together, brief but rich. And Steve, we just want to thank you for the time spent and for sharing with our listeners so much of your experience through your book and now through this interview. Thank you for being with us.
You're very welcome, Mags.
We hope that you found this episode to be inspiring and useful with many practical ideas. I know I'll be listening to it again, and I warmly recommend Steve's book to you. We want to make it available to you, and the first 5 listeners who write to us and ask will receive a free copy of Steve's book. We'll send it to you. Write to us at info@globalmissionspodcast.com, and we will get that book out to you. Remember that if you've been driving or riding while listening to this episode, if you've missed any of the links or resources or ideas, you can find it all in the show notes. There are some great lists for this episode. It's on our website at globalmissionspodcast.com. We invite you to respond to that as well. Join us in the conversation through the website, the Facebook page, or on Twitter. That's it for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue this conversation exploring the grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.